Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Dr. Brittany Panico, board certified rheumatologist at Summit Rheumatology in Phoenix, Arizona. And I have a very special guest today, just in time for July. I have Dr. Singla with Rheum To Grow, a pediatric rheumatology practice in the Houston area. And she is here to chat with us about all things kind of juvenile arthritis and how, as pediatric rheumatology, we can help our patients transition to adult rheumatology. We're going to talk about some fun things in that regard. And July is National Juvenile Arthritis Month. So I'm really excited to have her as a guest this month, especially. We can talk about some juvenile arthritis awareness topics. And we'll just see where this conversation takes us. So welcome, Dr. Singla. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I am a pediatric rheumatologist here in Houston, like you mentioned. I'm also board certified in integrative medicine. And so I kind of approach chronic disease probably a little bit different than I did prior to my training with integrative medicine. So, and most of that stems from the fact that I myself got diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis while I was practicing. And so, when the table flips a little bit, you start to realize the day-to-day issues that we don't always get to address in a regular traditional practice. So of course we talk about the medications and side effects, but like the timing of the medications and what are you taking on your vacations and how do you kind of track for a flare and all those practical tips I feel like I'm able to incorporate because of the diagnosis I have, for better
That's
or worse.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing your story. And I think too, it's really valuable when we understand something from the patient's perspective. I think bringing that, to our population and to our patients is so valuable because a lot of times, both I'm sure in the pediatric world and adult world is we sort of give this blanket, like, this is what to expect, right? This is kind of what we hear patients talking about rather than actually saying, I can identify with where you're coming from because
Yes.
it's either something, I might have experienced or
Right.
family member or something like that. So, and I think the integrative, medicine aspect, so many of us are trying to incorporate that. And there's now, board certification for integrative medicine, which I've sort of, thought about myself. I do a lot of, nutrition and anti-inflammatory kind of weaving in and out of my practice as well. So that's great that you can bring that, to your practice and to your patients. So
yeah,
awesome.
I think it's really valuable because I think we're so fixated on like this instant gratification mindset, and everybody, me included, like we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we want to see stuff, results right away. Same with disease, like we want the disease to go away right away. But sometimes now that I've gone through it, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's not like, here, take your medicines, do what you're supposed to, and we'll see you in 3 months and everything will get better. It's not so straightforward. I wish it was. And so to kind of like mentally prepare someone for that, I think is the key. Otherwise your expectation is like, well, why isn't stuff happening right away?
Right.
And that's kind of the part where integrative medicine, you got to put the work in, because I'm not going to be eating well for you. I'm not going to be exercising. I'm not journaling and doing breath work. It's you. So I'm a small part of the equation. You are it.
Yes. Yes.
And I don't think people kind of view it like that.
Yeah. And what kind of tips or sort of techniques? So you mentioned kind of, obviously the diet is a big component of arthritis care and even autoimmune. I mean, we can talk lupus, psoriatic arthritis, all of those diagnoses. But what is another, you mentioned breath work and, I'm sure meditation and journaling. What are some tips that you provide your patients? And I think too, just, because it's you and I talking to an audience who, possibly is transitioning right from the pediatric realm into the adult realm. What are some things that you find really valuable for your patients to help with that sort of identity shift, right? Going from, I'm a teenager struggling with just the world, right? How to understand, not only navigate young adulthood, but my disease process. Then you're telling me, okay, I've built this relationship with you. Now I need to have a new person and build a new relationship. So what are some things that you find really helpful for your patients to do kind of during that phase of life?
Right. So the biggest thing is it's a lot of mindset work, because when I'm diagnosing JIA in like a school age child, they're not as focused on like how different they might be perceived. They just want to play like everybody else, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm focusing on that age group, the biggest thing I'm working on is resiliency and coping strategies, these weekly injections that a 4-year-old, 5-year-old has to take, right? So we do a lot of pain reduction techniques through, depending on the age, I'll take bubbles and show them how to do deep breaths through that. At night, there's various apps and different YouTube videos you can watch to help with breath work, and just to let them know that nighttime is the time where you kind of release any stress that you're holding in different parts of your body. So
Mm-hmm.
for the younger kids, it might be like a pufferfish breathing technique where they watch a little pufferfish take a deep breath in, hold it, and deflate and do that. The consistency is key regardless of how old you are. You can be 0 years old or 100 years old. Your consistency is key in
Mm-hmm.
doing this. So a lot of the stress management coping techniques occur then. Also, as they get transition more into the teen years, that's where they're trying to discover themselves, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really like to incorporate not only the breath work at that point, but journaling or drawing, some sort of expressive arts. Because journaling, I do like a big brain dump of like, okay, what are the things that are bothering you? This is like free therapy. We can do therapy if you want to do it, but free therapy is just at night writing down what are the things that are bothering you. And it could just be drawing and releasing those feelings.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't feel like, also I encourage them to know that they're not the only ones going through this,
Right.
right? There are other kids just like you, and this is what's worked for them. We have to find what works for you. And so
Mm-hmm.
journaling might be it. It might be using an app to listen to a story, to do visualization, whether it's a painful day or a more stressful day, we kind of have to find a way to deal with it. We don't brush it and put it underneath the rug, because
Right.
that only builds up at some point somewhere else in the body.
Yes. Yes.
So we kind of face it head on and know that this is just a snapshot in time. This is not represent what the rest of your life will look like on those bad days, right? So when you're starting to process a little bit more of like, oh, this is chronic, this is not going away, it's more, okay, what are we going to do to deal with it? And then the older you get, then I'll start forcing the kids to do symptom tracking. Like, all right, every time you have a flare, let's do a recap. Let's do a bird's eye view. What did you travel? Have you not slept? Are you stressed? What are you eating? All those things. Is there a
Mm-hmm.
bully involved? We have all those things to worry about in the ped side. So usually we can kind of gather, like, every time I don't get sleep, this happens,
Yeah.
so then we know moving forward that this is something we need to worry about if we're traveling or we're having a stretch coming up of finals and whatnot. So it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like figuring out what works for you and what doesn't, because essentially that's what adulthood is, right? It's like figuring out your boundaries,
Yes.
figuring out like what to say yes to, what to say no to, what works for you. You can't just please everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And that when you have a chronic illness, it's really, really important to have to put yourself first. Otherwise, you're going to pay it somewhere.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
it just depends on the age and stage of the child slash adolescent. And the older you get, the more firm I am with in terms of, okay, what caused your flare? How do you spell your medications? Humira does not start with an E. Like we go through it all. I literally give them quizzes. My nurse gives them quizzes that I've typed up, like list your meds. When do you not take it? What kind of questions are you going to ask the adult rheumatologist? Okay. Where are you going to college? And that's a whole different battle, is figuring out how to pick your rheumatologist based on, okay, where you're going to school, where you're coming home during the breaks. Like,
Yes.
that's another, these are, none of this happens in one visit. These are take time, these take time.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
So
awesome. I mean, I'm so excited to hear that you're doing those things, because I think it really does help prepare somebody for that transition in a way that it's like, okay, we're doing the steps that lead up to this big change, right? Rather than just sort of, again, you talked about brushing things under the rug. I think a lot of times it's so easy just to keep pushing, things forward and saying, oh, we'll deal with it later. We'll deal with it later. And in adult rheumatology, the same applies too, right? Like, do we address coping mechanisms early and throughout each visit versus when somebody comes in really struggling and then trying to backtrack all of that,
right.
time and effort. So
Yes. I teach it as like we play defense plus offense at the same time. Like we're treating the disease. That's it. It's happened. Now we're using the medications, doing what we need to, but at the same time we're also kind of trying to prevent anything bad from happening.
Yes.
The badness from happening, whether it's a flare, reducing your risk of heart disease later down the line. Like my job is to worry about you now, but also a future you that you're probably not thinking about.
Yes. Yeah. I have the same approach too. And I think when you see patients' eyes light up of like, oh, you're actually thinking about those things, it's like really rewarding to help them understand, like, yes, I see the person in front of me, but I'm also thinking about what you're going to be like 5, 10, 20 years from now too. So,
right. Because
yeah.
sometimes the family doesn't see their dynamics. Like you have the mother or father who likes to coddle, which is everybody, right? But especially when you have a child with a chronic illness. But I'm like, that behavior is not going to serve you when you walk into the rheumatologist office with your mom in the waiting room, right? Like we got to get you more independent. And so I can see that they can't. And so my goal is to gingerly kind of get them ready for the adult side.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, those are wonderful tips. I think that's really great. So, and then one of the things too, I kind of just wanted to touch on is sort of how, again, talking about kind of these transitions and helping our patients sort of move through the pediatric to adult phase of things. One of the things in adult rheumatology that I think is really important for people to hear is that as you sort of evolve, your arthritis or your lupus symptoms evolve, sometimes the name or the identity that we sort of give you can change too. And that sometimes is a little bit tricky to navigate because when you're called something or diagnosed with something, as a child or as an adolescent, and that sort of then becomes more of an adult world, I try to spend time, with patients and say, okay, well, in adult language, in our kind of nomenclature, the things that we do, we can leave that juvenile arthritis diagnosis, but then how does that translate into how we treat you as an adult? So, medication sometimes can change, and the things that we can offer are a little bit different. So that's something kind of too is, in that transition of, sometimes, your relationship with your treatment can be different.
Yeah. That's a really good point you bring up because I don't know that we as pediatric rheumatologists do a wonderful job in preparing them for potential name changes / identity
it
changes.
doesn't really matter, but sometimes patients are really, that's your identity. That's part of your identity, right?
Yeah, like juvenile arthritis versus rheumatoid arthritis. Like nobody wants to, like when you've heard that for 11 years, 12 years, and then now you're transitioning to RA on all your paperwork, it is a little bit of weirdness. It's not that you've changed, your disease process has changed, maybe a little bit, but overall it's still the same. But I think we as pediatric rheumatologists could probably do a better job in titling and saying, hey, this is what to expect when you're transitioning, is that some of the names might change, but it doesn't mean that what you have or what we've treated is any different.
Right.
And the name change might actually open up more treatment options for you, right? Like you might have, the FDA loves to give rules on who can, who can't, right? Use certain medications, the age cutoff, they're very specific, which I understand. So when you have that name change to rheumatoid arthritis, a whole new world of therapies opens up. And yes, you might actually have to change therapies because there's no guarantee that Humira is going to work for you for X amount of years. We might have to switch. So we need to be a little bit more, I need cognitive flexibility is what we need to teach.
Yes. Yeah. Right? I love that phrase, cognitive flexibility.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, even we're creatures of habit, right? So when someone says to you, hey, you're not a child anymore, you're now an adult in the eyes of the law, it's kind of a weirdness. You're like, yesterday I was 17, today I'm 18 and I'm a full-blown adult. It's kind of that same, you have to prepare for it. Like we all prepare for that big transition from 17 to 18th birthday, right? But then I don't know that we do the same for PD to adult room.
Yeah. And with any, chronic process, right, that starts as a child or adolescent and then translates, I think, it's all a big transition. And, the more that we sort of like let our patients know this thing might be happening, you know, for a
Yeah.
lot of people that's helpful. For some people it might not be, but
Yeah. Yeah. And most people are receptive to it. It's not that they're like, no way, she's not changing my name to rheumatoid arthritis. You know, I think it's the lead up to it. It's the preparation, just like you do anything else, like you're preparing for anything else. You just got to educate them.
right.
And so that you're right. We're so fixated on, do you know the names of your medicine? Who's your emergency contact? What's the name of your new
Yeah.
rheumatologist? How are you going to go there? You know, when are you going there? And we don't, the bigger picture at play is kind of equally important.
Yeah, yeah. And a little while ago, you kind of touched on the sort of college transition. So that's something that I work on as well because I'm in a college town in Phoenix. There are several, you know, community colleges and then obviously, you know, university.
Yeah.
So in, you know, big kind of urban areas, when we transition our patients from, you know, their pediatric practice to their adult practice, sometimes that transition happens like right around the same time as college, right? Or sort of you leave town, you're kind of forced to get a new rheumatologist in your college town.
Right.
So how do you sort of help prepare your patients to navigate that? Because as an adult rheumatologist, I want to be available to that college population coming in and
Yeah.
you know, maybe by you talking about it, I can then help sort of navigate a lot of those, you
Yeah.
know, that type of patient too.
You know, the discussion with college really starts around 11th grade, like 10th, 11th grade for my patients. I'll start seeding the idea of, oh, hey, we got college applications coming up in the fall. Have you thought about where you want to go? And so based on those cities, I'll say, all right, so here are some institutions that have rheumatologists that I've worked with or that has seen your condition. If it's a rare condition, right? Like in pediatrics, sometimes we deal with more genetic type stuff, then we'll say, okay, you should probably stick to this type of institution. But if they have lupus, if they have any form of arthritis or even like Sjogren, you know, it depends on what it is. I'll say, give me where you're going, and then I'll help them kind of look up the doctors that are there. And I try to let the patient do it, because at this point they need to understand what to look for in a doctor. So I say, go on their website, see the type of patients that they see, look at their reviews, call their office, ask questions. Like, all that is free. No one's charging you for that.
Yeah,
But you
exactly.
have to do the work. So, and then once, by the time we get to like senior year, I'm like, okay, we we
Yeah.
need to know where we're sending you next year. And sometimes, to be honest, that decision, they decide to go to community college or stay local for a little bit, and then once they know where they're going, then I will transition them at like 20, 21 instead of 18, 19. And so it just really depends on, this is where the proactiveness of their, you know, behaviors come in. Like, I need to know where you're going, not your mom telling me where you're going. You need to tell me where you're going. And so together we kind of pick different doctors and go from there.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think too, you know, those of us who are interested in those transition patients, we can do a better job too of, again, you mentioned the website, right? Like advertising, you know, that we see transition patients or, you know, that we're open or close, right? Close to a university or community college. Because I think too, navigating distance is tricky, right? You may not necessarily be somewhere where public transportation is that great, right? In Arizona, you know, we don't really rely too much on public transportation. So, you know, that's things too for us adult rheumatologists that we can do a better job of advertising, you know, that
I
we're
think
available for patients.
that's a great point. Like, because on most adult rheumatologist website, it has like the conditions they treat, but and maybe if you're super specialized in something, it'll have it on there. But the transition kids, like, you know, you just kind of go by, all right, well, they're here. You don't want to just pick a doctor based on location, especially if you have multiple options. And then, so if you say like, I'm comfortable with transitioning, you know, transitioning from peds to adults, that's a plus, 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 because some adult rheumatologists don't like that. That's just not their niche. So if that's your niche, then I would just blast it on there.
Great. I will make note of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's very helpful. So, and kind of, you know, we've mostly touched on like the arthritis aspect of rheumatology, but it's summer, we're all probably vacationing, there's sun everywhere. We're both in states where we see a lot of sun, a lot of
Right.
hot days. So what's something that you sort of help with your lupus patients kind of, and even dermatomyositis, right? Like in pediatric, that might
Yeah.
be a little more common than we see in adulthood, but
Right.
again, those patients transition to us.
Yeah.
So what are some tips that you have for your patients when they're traveling to help with sun exposure and to help to, again, kind of, this might be their first vacation without their parents. They may be doing something independent as a, high school graduation gift or something like that. So what
Yeah.
are some tips you have for your patients with the sun and
Yeah.
vacationing?
That's a really good question. First of all, I always say SPF is your BFF. So like when you have an autoimmune disease,
Yes.
slap it on. Like, and I can preach it as much as I want to, but if the patient doesn't understand the
Right.
importance, I might as well be talking to a wall, because they're not going to do it, especially if they're going on a trip to like Cancun with their friends, So I like to hear it from them. I'll say, okay, I've explained to you why it's important. What is your understanding of why it's important? And I think when they start verbalizing it, it sinks in like, okay, this could lead to a flare if I don't protect myself from the sun. And
Mhm.
so then I'll say, all right, what kind of things are realistic? Like, not everybody wants to wear a rash guard. Not, what are some stylistic things that we can do
Right. Yeah.
at that age? So sunglasses, we have the mineral SPF, and that you can use, that's non-chalky. They have some
Mhm.
good brands now. Wide brimmed hat. We want to try it if we're going to a sun vacation. We want to stick to like cabana type situation if we can, or at
Mhm.
least cover your face as much as you can with the hat. um, Rash guard ideally, but at least have some sunblock on to cover yourself, and then minimum bouts of exposure. I don't want you to sit out there and dry out like a prune from like 10 to 2. You
Mhm.
need to just take little breaks and stay hydrated. And
Yeah.
if at any point you feel like you're getting red or itchy or flaky, we need to probably tone it down.
Mhm.
That's not just for lupus patients or dermatomyositis patients. That's everybody across the board. You probably need to cool down a little bit.
Yes.
But it's more important if you have an autoimmune condition, because that UVA, UVB can trigger the flares that we
Right.
know, right?
Right.
As long as they understand that, I understand that, we're on the same page.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I had a patient when I was practicing in Chicago, a young woman. She had dermatomyositis, early diagnosed, I think in her teens. So then, of course, I see her when she's, in her 20s, and she loved her beach vacations. And every summer she'd come back and we'd have to have the same conversation. And it's kind of, sometimes they just have to sort of experience that
Right.
flare and realize, like, okay, this is a consequence of when I do
Yeah.
this.
Right.
But it is really helpful, just to keep, as we keep reiterating, we do for our lupus patients as well. And just,
Right.
being aware too, depending on your home climate, even, right? Like just really minimizing sun exposure and your time outside in the sun in the heat of summer.
Right, right. Especially now, like this year has been incredibly hot. I think
Yeah.
it helps that you don't really want to be out in the
Right.
sun for too long. But at the same time, it's just some people learn the hard way. So if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. And some people don't care. They'll keep flaring, and that's okay because they're enjoying their life. So
Mhm.
you got to find like a middle ground on what you're okay with. But
Yeah.
in general, I would say let's try to not stimulate the immune system.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And I think, it's so hard for people to kind of visualize that, I think, right? That because we don't, I have a conversation with patients. We don't have control over our immune system in the same way we have control over what we wear, right? We don't,
Right,
we're not consciously telling our immune system to behave a certain way, but our actions and our exposures are how we have that control. And I
yeah.
think with your background with integrative medicine, right, it all goes back to what are you putting in your body and
Mhm.
on your body potentially, that
Yeah.
helps control your condition.
It's true. I think part of, people with chronic illnesses are at higher risk for anxiety. And I think the anxiety component comes from not feeling like you have control.
Right.
right? It's the whole issue at heart is the immune system has done what it wants to do.
Yes.
And when there are things you can control, things you can't control. So what we're going to have to pick our battle and let go of the stuff, the worry that we absolutely have no control over, right? If we all had a crystal ball, wonderful. I would use it all day long. But I can tell you that this is what's going to cause a flare. So let's try to control this, right? The mindset work is really important.
Right.
It's hard, especially when you're used to being like type A, things go your way, and now all of a sudden the world has come crashing down. We got to backtrack a little bit.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. Yeah, and I think too, even as we navigate the adult diagnoses, you talk about anxiety and that aspect of things, and journaling, like you said, all the tips that you use for your kids and adolescents are helpful for adults as well.
Yeah.
Do you have any like book resources that are helpful that we can post the link to, or things like that, just on how some people like to kind of have something that they can refer back to over and over?
There's not like a workbook that I can think of, but there was what helped me is there's a book called When Perfect Isn't Good Enough. I think it's something along those lines, when it kind of makes you realize that what's gotten you this far in life, in your job, in your personal life, is not going to serve you moving forward with your illness, with anything really. So it's more of, well, you have this chronic illness. It doesn't make you any weaker, right? It happened to you, and now we just kind of got to control things we can control. And once you kind of let go of it's good, it's all good. I think it makes day-to-day much easier to deal with, much more positive outlook. And I'm not the type of person that like makes you suck positivity down your throat until you collapse. It's realism. It's like, well, you have two options. Either you can learn to cope and let go, right? Or you're just going to be holding on to stuff that is not doing you any service. So I think that book helped me just for my personality type. That helped. If I think of anything else, I'll let you know.
Sure. Yeah. And that's helpful, because I think, I'm a parent of young kids. My oldest is 7. And as we navigate sort of just, again, how to talk to our kids about changes and adversity and adaptation and things like that, the younger you can learn those skills and be thinking about it, right? You don't have to master. We're never like going to be masters of these things, but when we learn it and then can refer back to, okay, these are the things that are helpful. These are the things that can, again, calm me down, effectively and safely, right? Instead of sort of going through hiding things and then, developing unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Right. And the other part you have to realize is like doing breath work at night is not going to fix all your problems, right? The reason we do it is to train your nervous system to kind of let go of the fight and flight and to be more relaxed, right? So then when a tough situation does happen and you start practicing the breath work, your bounce back or resiliency is a lot faster because you've been training this muscle up here. So it's the same mind. Like you don't just run and then qualify for a marathon in 24 hours, right? Like you have to build up to it. So it's the same thought process. We just don't, I think that's not the outlook we have on it. But now that like being a patient, that's exactly the outlook we have to have.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's this whole, and you mentioned it in the beginning of our conversation, this whole aspect of like, we're looking for instant gratification. We're looking for things to happen now, but the reality is all of this takes time. All of, this work is more of that marathon training than the instant, okay, I'm qualified, or I can handle this now sort of thing.
Yeah. And it's just a sign of the times in our society. Like meditation is not really a billion-dollar industry like supplements and all the other wellness stuff out there. But what really works is the key and consistency to doing something like meditation. And that takes time and patience. So that's really what you're teaching, is that there is light at the end of the tunnel. You just got to be consistent.
Right. Yeah. And with anything, I mean, any skill, right, is going to take time to develop. So you're absolutely right. Yeah. Well, awesome. Any last sort of bits of wisdom that you'd like to impart on us for, again, kind of as we help our patients maybe during this transition, or just something, about Juvenile Arthritis Awareness Month that you'd like to kind of plug for us?
Yes, yes. So July is definitely juvenile arthritis month. And most people that I've talked to are like, there's no way kids can have arthritis. I'm like, well, if that was the case, I wouldn't have a job, number one. But they do, and it's not an old people disease. And having a quote unquote old people disease when you're 4 is the ball game changes a little bit, right? So for kids, it's not just take your medicines, it's being consistent, like we talked about, and doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that process is being proactive and asking questions. And once you learn how to ask questions and get comfortable with it, I think it's a habit that it doesn't go away. So
Right.
I always advocate for, like, if you don't understand something that your adult rheumatologist is saying, ask them.
Mm-hmm.
Ask them. Call me. Like, just ask. It's better to ask than to do something without knowing why you're doing it or
Mm-hmm.
what you're doing. And so that curiosity will carry you not just for the medical part, but for other parts of your life as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. I had a conversation with one of my 70-year-old patients yesterday, actually, about, asking for what you want. She came in
Yeah.
with something that was not necessarily rheumatologically related, but she was struggling, and her family wanted her to see a rheumatologist just to, see if we could fit the pieces together. And I said, well, who have you talked to about these things? And she's like, nobody. I said, well, the first thing is that you have to speak up and
Yeah.
actually let somebody know that that's an issue for
Right.
you,
Right.
because we can't see through you. We don't have that crystal ball to know what's been going on. And I said, you're here in the doctor's office for a snapshot of time, right? My appointments are a little bit longer. I'm really fortunate, but for some people, they're very fast appointments. So if you're sitting there nodding your head, agreeing
Yeah.
that everything is fine, that's the perception you're giving your doctor, is
Right.
that you're doing okay. So if you're
Yeah.
not speaking or letting us see that you're struggling, we have no way of knowing that,
Yeah.
right?
And you want to help your patient, not
Yeah,
just be like, great, everything's great. So you can't play the game of read my mind. I can't
right.
believe you didn't read my mind. It's like,
We
well, I don't have
all
that.
want to play that game.
Yeah, I know. I don't have that power. So yeah, it's really important, no matter how old you are, to speak up. Like, kids do it at a young age because they're so innocent. They don't have that frontal lobe capacity to filter their thoughts, So it's almost the same thing. Now you're more refined. You know how to ask your question. So
Yeah.
don't be afraid.
Yeah. And it's not a thing about embarrassment. I think sometimes people are nervous or embarrassed, or, what are we going to think if they ask a question?
Yeah.
That same family that I was talking about, the spouse said, can I ask you a dumb question? I was like, well,
Yeah.
there aren't any dumb questions, first of all, but you can ask me and I'll do my best to answer. And he asked a very legitimate question that transitioned the way that I went with the rest of the visit. And I was like,
Mm,
I'm so glad you asked me that, because I don't know that that's what you're thinking about, again, until you voice it, right? And I
yeah.
can't predict every single scenario of questions that people are going to have.
No.
None of us can. So
Yeah.
it's really important to sort of let go of that kind of feeling of like, what are they going to think of me if I
Yeah.
ask, or if I say this, right?
Right. Right.
And for
It's
kids, adults, I don't
Mhm.
think, it doesn't matter. It's am I taking my medication right? Like, you seem very, ingrained with your patients about how to take their
Yeah.
medication.
Yeah.
And I think as adults, we tend to lose sight of, like,
Mm,
okay, are you consistent? Are you struggling with the way that I'm prescribing something? Do you understand your prescription?
yeah.
Right? We sort of take for granted, you write a prescription out, they
Yeah.
fill it and they take it, and
Right.
we have to double check, right? We have to double check that that's what they're actually
Mhm.
doing.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, personal story. Like, I didn't know how to inject. I prescribed medicines all day long, subcutaneous injections. I'm like, level up, down. How do you do this? Like, am I doing it right? It took me multiple tries to get it right. And I
mhm,
was embarrassed. I was like, oh my goodness, I don't know how to give it to myself, but I can show you how to do it. But I'm a little bit terrified to do it on my own. So
mhm,
there's no shame in not knowing how to do something or not knowing an answer. I think it could be potentially more harmful to try and do something to not feel embarrassed or to look, embarrassing. So
mhm.
it's not worth it. Just ask the question, get it out.
Yes, yes. or write it down, right? If you
I'll
feel
write it
like
down.
you can't say it, write it down.
Yeah.
I was telling, somebody else, to another patient, I said, we kind of have gotten out of this phase of the list, right? Like there's this whole perception that doctors hate the lists that patients bring. It's like, bring it to me, because then I can answer your questions that you have, and direct the flow of those questions if you feel like you just can't remember to ask them, or that you don't know, how to phrase it or bring it up. So I actually, I don't mind the list. If I'm handed a list, I can go down the list and
Yeah.
answer those questions.
You want to make the most of the visit.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And then too, I'm sure you coach your patients when things aren't working in between those appointments to call, right? Like
Yeah.
we want to know when you're struggling before it's too late, or before it gets too far down the line that we then have to have the conversation about sending you to the hospital.
Right.
So we'd
Or
rather know
switch.
in
Yeah.
between those visits when you're struggling, then have you come in and have the conversation of, let's get you,
Yeah.
you know,
Because we know the repercussions of stuff not going right. Right.
right.
And so we want to prevent the badness from happening. And you are part of the equation. You have to let us know when things aren't going your way. Right. If you don't feel good, if you're having reactions, your medicine hasn't come in, like these are all issues, real issues.
Yeah.
So yeah, tell us sooner than later.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, this has been amazing. I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to talk today, and I really appreciate all your tips. And I think, your feedback too is really helpful for me to navigate sort of, the community that I'm in with patients transitioning, and, being a college town, how I can help my patients.
Likewise too.
Yeah, so thank you so much. And then how can we find you, either on social media or your website?
Yeah, so you can visit my website if you are a adolescent child, even adult with rheumatic condition. Now, I'm not going to manage your adult rheumatology issues, but if you would like the integrative consult and you live in Texas, I'm happy to do that. My website is www.rheum2growtx. So Rheum is RHEUM, and then TOGROWTX.com. I'm also on Instagram at Rheum2growtx and Facebook as well.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, and I'll tag those things on this link too as well. So thank you so much for joining us, and
Thank you.
we'll chat again soon.
All right.